5 Stories in Camping. Story 1. I took a trip to the Huasteca Wilderness Area, which is like a designated wilderness area, located between Sierra Gorda and Nevado, the Toluca State Parks. As the name suggests, it is one of the wildest and most secluded areas of natural beauty in the state of San Luis Potosí. You have to drive to a small place called El Naranjo and then turn onto a small side road until the pavement ends and the trail begins. There are a cabin or two out there, but they don't mind you stationing there as long as you don't leave a mess. And the place is so secluded that there's hardly anyone else there to worry about. But when I arrived late on Friday afternoon, there was another car there with a girl leaning against it. She was cute, dressed in hiking clothes, but she looked angry. Not exactly furious or anything like that, but very upset about something. I parked some distance away from her. I didn't want to overwhelm her or provoke any anger or anything like that. And then I got out of the car and started taking my gear out of the trunk. I didn't want to be a stalker and start an unwanted conversation or anything like that, so I resigned myself to walking past her and doing my own business. But as he started walking, we made a little awkward eye contact and started talking. We exchanged greetings and I asked her if she was okay, and she replied no, and that was it. Turns out, you missed a friend for an excursion you were looking forward to and didn't feel like driving all the way back home with nothing to show for it. She was thinking of going up the trail alone, but she also wanted to see if she could convince her friend to come anyway, as she was well aware that hiking alone as a woman wasn't the brightest idea. I told myself it was the right thing to do, but I also knew that inviting her to hike with me was a great way to meet a very pretty girl who clearly shared a passion for the outdoors. So I did that and asked her if she wanted to join me. There was a moment of hesitation on her part. I didn't seem to be the type of girl who would just be walking down a remote forest trail with a complete stranger, and for a second I thought she was going to politely reject me. But then there was like a flash of spontaneity in his eyes before he looked at me with a big smile and said sure. He told me her name was Paula, and as we walked, I explained that I was planning to camp somewhere to stay all weekend, but that I would be happy to accompany her back to her car when she was ready to leave. He thanked me, said he was sweet for volunteering, and then continued to break the ice and exchange small talk. Then, once we felt more comfortable with each other, I can safely say that it was one of the best first dates I've ever been on. It definitely had this kind of vibe. I'm not a Disney prince or anything like that, but I'm not terrible to watch, and I know when a girl is flirting with me and not just being polite or nice or whatever. So, as we walked and talked, I started to get quite excited about where this might lead. It had been a while since I tried to date someone, and my brief jump to Tinder had been a total disaster. I always found it much more appealing to meet a person naturally rather than using the internet to force it. But as many of you will agree, that's much easier said than done. Since it was a mutual interest, we talked a lot early on about hiking, places we'd been, compromising situations we'd had, and things like that. But as time went on, we started talking about other things as well, like our jobs, our families, and relationships. She told me that she had been single for a while, but wasn't looking for anything at the time. But she was also quick to add that if something suitable came along, she would be open to changing her mind about not looking for anything. It seemed like a loaded statement, but it was very welcome. And as we continued walking, I wondered if this chance encounter with her was the beginning of some lifelong romance. Now, looking back, I'm actually ashamed of how naive that sounds, but I guess loneliness is a very strong thing. Maybe an hour into our hike, we were walking along the edge of the creek when Paula stopped to take a photo. She then asked me to give her a second while she texted her friend, saying I didn't have enough signal for a call, but she could probably force a text through me. It was a very familiar dance. Huasteca is quite close to a town, but thanks to all the hills around us, the cell signal was quite difficult to find. While she was texting, I walked away a bit down the creek, waiting for Paula to finish, and Just as I was turning around to go back, I heard something in the trees behind me. It instantly reminded me of that feeling of being followed. But this time I really made an effort to find out if there was anything or someone following us. I started walking straight to where I had heard the noise, calling and asking if anyone was there. And that's when I saw it. This big guy, dressed in hiking clothes and walking away from me at a steady pace. I found the hiking clothes quite reassuring in some ways, as if I could give them the benefit of the doubt. But at the same time, I was confronted with evidence that we were being followed. Huasteca is a big place, and it sure gets pretty crowded on a weekend, but not on a Friday afternoon, which is half the reason I like to get ahead of myself by arriving at that time. The chances of meeting someone, especially off the trails, are minimal. So, even though I was pretty convinced that we were being followed, I still wanted to confront that guy to make sure. I called him out, not aggressively, just to get his attention, to ask him something pretty innocent like, "Are you okay?" or something. But when he turned, I was speechless. He was dressed like a hiker, but he was wearing thick, heavy gloves, almost like those ride gloves you see with hard knuckles. The lower half of his face was covered with a kind of hunting scarf, the kind in which only the person's eyes are visible. While today, covering your face like that may be acceptable, in 2015 it was definitely not a normal occurrence, especially since the guy didn't have any orange indicators on his hunting clothes, or more importantly, he didn't have any weapons in sight. I was relieved not to see a gun in his hands, but the fact that he was covering his face meant that he was clearly doing something wrong. And then there was the fact that he just refused to answer me when I finally asked him if everything was okay. He just gave me a death stare for a second and then turned again and went into the woods. Now my mind was racing like crazy, following her rhythm. Following us down a single trail was one thing, but this guy had followed our tracks through a clearing and then just stayed on our trail, although we changed directions seemingly randomly. I'd like to think I'm some kind of nature lover, but for me, those were frequently accurate tracking skills. And if this guy was using his abilities for evil, that would be a big problem for us. I ran back with Paula, told her exactly what I had seen, and told her that we had to move fast. I told him that I knew he sounded crazy, and that I completely understood why he would think he was an idiot or whatever. But I would rather he think he was an idiot and live than act on nothing and risk our lives to both. So many horrible things seem to happen because people don't stop and just tell themselves that this isn't normal or safe, and that they need to leave. And I was having one of those moments at the time. I gave my little speech at the speed of a machine gun, and I honestly thought I had convinced her for a second. But when I was done and started walking while I motioned for her to follow me, she just stood still. I remember saying, "We need to go, Paula, now." But instead of following me, she slapped me verbally. She told me that I was acting like a complete idiot, and that if we were being followed, she would have known something about it. She wasn't a helpless girl either, so I resented acting like that, and according to her, just because someone was on our trail didn't mean they acted maliciously. They were all good points, and on any other occasion, I could have repeated them again. But I knew this was no other time. There was something distinctly shady about this strange guy, and we needed to exercise due caution immediately. And that's when I started noticing this gradual change in the way Paula spoke to me. It went from something like, "Come on, man, you're being ridiculous," and urged me to stay, to accuse me of being a mixture of fool, cowardly, and mentally ill. He wanted to take her back to his car. She wanted to stay still and not even move somewhere farther away from the creek. And if I wanted to move or leave her, then I wasn't half the man I thought I was, among other personal attacks from her. I remember being confused beyond belief. Honestly, it seemed like any girl in her right mind would at least be a little alarmed at the prospect of being followed by a man in a mask. But here was Paula, not even a little bothered by the sight of me visibly altered, as I warned her of the potential danger. The only mitigating factor, I suppose, Was the idea that she thought I was the one trying to trick her into, I don't know, going somewhere more remote, so I could be a serial killer without being caught? I totally understood that, and I suspected that her reluctance came from there, and not from being stupid or naive or distrustful enough not to respond to my warnings. We were both being pretty loud at the time, arguing back and forth, and I realized that our volume would make it very easy for someone to locate us and catch us off guard. I remember looking around just to make sure we were still alone, and I felt that skin-crawling feeling knowing that we really were alone in the woods, at least in appearance. However, that did not diminish the sense of danger he felt. I knew we had to move, but Paula was determined to stay where we were. I tried to reason with her, explained that it wasn't about me trying to deceive her, but worrying about our safety. But every time I tried to talk, she would raise her tone of voice, accusing me of things that just weren't true. Finally, I decided that I couldn't force her to leave with me. If she wanted to stay there, it was her right. But I couldn't stay and risk my own safety. I told him that I would go get help, and that I would return as soon as possible. She nodded, visibly annoyed, but said nothing. I began to walk as fast as possible, trying not to make a noise and paying attention to any sound that might indicate the presence of the mysterious man who was following us. He was nervous and worried, but also determined to find help as soon as possible. After walking around for a while, I finally found a cell signal strong enough to make a call. I dialed the number 911 and explained the situation as best I could. I gave them the approximate location and asked them to send help as quickly as possible. After hanging up, I felt a little more relieved, but I was still worried about Paula. I hoped that he was okay and that help would arrive in time. I continued walking in the direction of where we had left the car, keeping my eyes and ears wide open for any signs of danger. He was eager to get to the car and drive back to the parking area where he expected to find emergency responders. Finally, I got to the car and got in quickly. I started the engine and drove as fast as I could back to the parking area. When I arrived, I saw several emergency vehicles parked there. I approached and explained the situation to the first responders, who immediately set out to look for Paula. I sat in the car, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. I was worried about Paula, but also relieved that help was on the way. I could only hope and pray that everything would be okay. Story 2. We started a small hiking trip in southern Mexico, specifically in the Jose Maria Morelos State Forest. We went through a few cabin rental options and found one that was within our budget, then booked it for a weekend. It was a beautiful place, not far from a heart-shaped lagoon with easy access to all the different hiking trails in the park. Our first day was wonderful. We had a picnic near the Emerald Lagoon, followed by a campfire-style dinner in our cabin. The day was beautiful, but the night was intimidating, to say the least. There were many huts scattered throughout the forest, so we weren't in a particularly secluded place. But the night in the village is very different from the night in the forest, especially if you grew up and spent most of your life in the former. There's something very disturbing about it, and both my partner and I comment on it independently of each other. We weren't scared at all. We felt very safe there, so the feeling was something new, I guess, and not something that deprived us of sleep. The second day was similar to the first. We did a bit of hiking, had another lunch outside, and then returned to the cabin in time for dinner. But instead of dining at the cabin, we went to La Cascada, just south of town, for a fancy 3-course dinner and a bottle of wine. We discussed taking a taxi to and from La Cascada, but decided I wanted to be fresh for the next morning. So I drove, and my partner had the wine a little too well. However, when we got back to the cabin, she was so drunk that she fell asleep the moment her head touched the pillow. I didn't reproach him for the opportunity to let his hair down like that. I thought it was funny, but it turned out to be very lucky that only one of us was in top shape that night, and I'll tell you why. After my partner fell asleep and snored really loudly, I should add, I brushed my teeth, took a shower, and then got into bed. It was just before midnight at that point, and I set an alarm for 7:30 a.m. I don't know how long later I woke up to what I assumed was my phone vibrating on the rustic wooden nightstand next to my head. I reached to grab it, only to realize that it wasn't my phone that was making noise. It was something else entirely, something gently scraping the wood on the other side of the cabin wall, almost right next to where I'd been resting my head. Now, even though this was very creepy for a second or two, I'm rational enough to realize that a sound like that is probably some kind of animal. And having done my research, I knew we only had to worry about snakes and possibly foxes or coyotes. There tended to be no bears or jaguars in this area of Mexico, or rather, the chances of encountering the former at least being extremely remote was the reason we chose the state forest in the first place, knowing that it was one of the safest options for hiking. So, like I said, hearing the sound was amazing but not scary. At first, I tried to go back to sleep, hoping that whatever was making that noise would get bored and go away. I know that many animals scratch their claws or teeth against the wood as a way to file them down or sharpen them, so I thought maybe it was something small and harmless doing exactly that. But then, the scratching started to move, and it sounded like it was coming from another section of the wall, much higher up than before. I say a lot higher up. They were just maybe a foot or two taller. But in my head, whatever was making the sound went from being the size of a squirrel to being the size of a fox. Again, this was quite alarming, and I lifted my head off the pillow again as I wondered if I should do something. In the end, I got out of bed, went to where I could hear the scratching, and then hit the wall a few times to try to scare him. And sure enough, that seemed to work, and the sound of my fist against the wall didn't wake my partner. So I went back to bed without saying a word. I swear I was about to fall asleep again when the scratching sound started again. I realized that if I wanted to have anything like a good night's sleep, I would have to go outside with my flashlight and really scare this thing. So I got out of bed, put on some clothes, and then went out into the dark with my flashlight. I could hear whatever it was that was scratching against the wood, but I wasn't at all scared, as I thought it would just walk away the first moment I saw the beam of my flashlight or heard my footsteps. And that's exactly what he did, and I heard him run into the darkness just before he turned the corner. But instead of the familiar four-legged cadence of a fox or coyote, I heard the very distinctive sound of something running with 2 feet, not 4. It was not an animal. I was a person, and I would swear to God that realization made the spookiest moment of my entire life. All that time I thought everything was fine, but there was some freak weirdo scratching something on the wood all the time, and I really tried to go back to sleep. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed the biggest and heaviest thing I could find, a frying pan, and then ran outside. He wanted to shout something brave and hard, but the truth of the gods is that he was scared to death. I could barely hold a coherent thought in my head, let alone decipher something intimidating to scream at. So I just ran around, spinning like a top and pointing the flashlight at every little shadow to make sure no one was about to stalk me. Once I was pretty sure the shoreline was really clear, I ran back to the cabin, locked the front door, and then woke up my partner. She was still half drunk, but she sobered pretty quickly when I told her to keep her cell phone handy, just in case she needed her to call 911. I still don't know if it was just a silly joke or if some kids were vandalizing the cabins or deliberately trying to scare us, but it all depended on what they had been scratching on the wall. That was clear, but I wasn't in the mood to just step back out into the dark to go check right away. We just stood still for a few minutes, with my hand gripping the handle of the pan, and listened for any voice, footstep, or scratch. After a few minutes of silence, I finally stepped out into the darkness for 2 reasons. Firstly, to make sure we were really alone again, and secondly, to see what the hell this weird had been doing to the outside wall of the cabin. I was scared, but I was also ready to shatter the skull of anyone foolish enough to attack me like that. Thankfully, I didn't have to defend myself like that. But there was nothing comforting about what I found scratched on the wall of the cabin. When I first saw it, it looked like someone had tried to write an O or the number 0 under a crudely scratched letter U or V. The result was that it almost looked like someone had tried to write VL, but vertically instead of horizontally. No words came to mind right away. I mean, if it was an O and then an I, maybe they were trying to spell the word kill, in which case we should be concerned. But the V and the O, I had no idea what that could mean. Convinced that it was nothing more than children being stupid vandals, I told my partner that I was safe outside, and that I could come and see what the children had been scratching. She seemed relieved to learn that it was nothing too sinister, and that we would probably remain quiet for the rest of our stay. In fact, all we occupied ourselves with for a minute or two was wondering if the owners would help themselves with our security deposit if they discovered the damage. After my partner got dressed, we both went outside to check on the damage. I focused my flashlight on him, showing him the strange shapes of V and O, and saw a very visible look of fear on his face. I asked her what she thought it was, and she asked how she couldn't see it. To me, they were just strange shapes or letters, and to her I was literally the devil. I'll be honest, at first I didn't really see it and thought it was just her nerves talking, but her fear turned out to be contagious, and when she decided she didn't want to stay another night in the cabin, I wasn't in a position to make her stay. I remember him saying, "This has all the red flags. We'd be idiots if we don't leave now." And he was honestly right. It didn't really matter who it was, or why they had been scratching something on the wall of our cabin. Our car was outside, and they could literally see that the cabin was occupied. And who the hell is snooping around the woods in the middle of the night like that? No one with anything good in mind, that's for sure. We packed our things, threw them all in the car, and left as soon as we could. First, my partner called the police to report what had happened, and then left a message to the owner of the cabin explaining the situation. They were kind enough to refund us for the last night of stay and return our security deposit in full, thus dismissing our bizarre conspiracy theory that the owners were trying to reclaim our security deposit. We still have no idea who or what was going on that night, and I'm honestly open to the idea that we just overreacted to some silly joke or something. But that being said, I don't have any regrets about cutting our little vacation short because my partner is right. We've seen enough horror movies to know that you don't stick around when things get weird. Story 3. One of my earliest memories is being on the playground of a new school, trying to make friends. This was in 3rd grade, so elementary school age for Mexicans reading it, and I came across a group of kids playing soccer. I asked one of them if I could join, and he said yes, but only if I passed him the ball. It seemed like a fair deal, so I agreed. The next day, I asked the same guy if I could sit with him on my lunch break, and he said yes, but only if I could have my dessert. Although it seemed fair to me, I agreed anyway, and then we ate in silence. I didn't touch my dessert assuming that guy would take it with him when he was ready, but when he finished his dessert, I offered him mine, and he suddenly changed his mind. He shook his head, pushed a small bowl towards me, and we've been friends ever since. Eduardo, as I called him by his middle name, was my best friend throughout elementary school, and we ended up in the same high school as well. I had my first soda with him. Our first girlfriends were best friends, and he was present at almost every significant event of my teenage years in one way or another. We eventually parted ways by going to different colleges, but we kept in touch, and he ended up coming back here for work once he graduated. He was there for me in all my breakups, helped me move into my first real apartment, and was the best man at his wedding, and the list goes on. I was there for all the ups and downs of him and Laura buying a house, having a baby, and all that other adult stuff. And I was the first person Eduardo called about the accident. It was at the beginning of April when he called me at about 2 in the morning. I knew something was going on because of how late the call was, but I could never have guessed how terrible the news was. Laura was taking her daughter back from the playgroup when two thieves crashed into them at a zebra crossing, and her daughter was pronounced dead at the scene, while Laura passed away in a hospital bed fighting for her life. And within hours, Eduardo's entire world had been snatched by two monsters in a car. I was devastated as you can imagine. He took sick leave from work, was prescribed antidepressants, and then went to live with his parents because he simply couldn't take care of himself. We all helped by taking care of him, making sure he stayed away from alcohol and all that. But that was pretty much all we could do. Losing your wife and child like that, so suddenly, is something you have to get through on your own, you know. And for a long time, Edward seemed paralyzed, and I honestly couldn't blame him. But one day I got a very amazing text message from him that simply said, "Are you ready to go for a walk?" To explain, taking a walk was what we called the hiking and camping trips we used to take when we were younger. I think we always fancied ourselves as explorers, but since we would never pass the urine test, we settled for these epic backcountry excursions, sometimes for a week. We camped in different places each night and returned home without showering and reeking of campfire smoke between telling ghost stories around the fire at night. It was a lot of fun. We managed to do about 5 or 6 big and small excursions before jobs and girlfriends started eating up all our time. But as much as I waited for the day when we could get back out, I thought it might have been a little too soon. After discussing it, we agreed on the second week of April, almost a year after the accident. I tried to tell myself that the timing was just a coincidence, but at the same time I completely understood if I wanted to get away from it all for a few days, especially around the 1-year anniversary. And there was always something quite comforting about our excursions. If you're running out of food and water, exposed to the elements, there's no time to worry about the problems you have in the real world quotes. He didn't know how far that would extend to the devastating duel, but in the short term it seemed to work, as Eduardo seemed much more animated, having something to focus his mind on. He was ordering camping gear online, trying it out in his mom's garden, and with all the planning we had to do, he was also much more talkative. It was like the old days in many ways, but with one noticeable difference. Aside from the obvious things, Eduardo had suggested a place to visit. Anyone reading this could say yes, so what? I had never made any of the decisions when it came to our hiking tours. After taking the lead in planning the first ones, he left everything in my hands so that he could focus on the team and get us there. So when he told me he wanted to visit Sumidero Canyon, and in particular a place called Chiapa de Corzo, it was a refreshing change, if I'm honest. We had never been to Chiapas before, so I was very eager to go. But Eduardo's zigzagging tour included lots of freshwater rivers, hill hikes, and a great breakfast at the end, which sounded absolutely great. The longest we'd been walking was a week, and since we were just starting over, I wasn't surprised when he said he only wanted to go for 2 days. I was just excited that he seemed to be getting back to being himself. But if I had known what I had really planned, I don't think I would have ever gone with him. Everything seemed fine on the trip to Chiapa de Corzo. In fact, it was like the old days. We took turns driving around and putting out old playlists, and generally enjoyed a bit of nostalgia to kill time on the trip. Parking was easy and cheap, and we also had unexpectedly good weather for April, which got us off to a good start on an epic hike. Considering it was his first time, Eduardo did an excellent job planning the route and took us through incredible landscapes. We wandered for about 8 or 9 kilometers, gently down a hill, and then along a narrow river until we reached a small lake. The path down was very steep, and the river fell into a waterfall that fed the larger lake. It was a spectacular setting, and I knew immediately that it would be our first camping spot. We found a nice, flat spot about 50 yards from the water's edge and set up our little A-shaped shelters looking at each other. Once we were ready, we brewed some tea on our gas stoves and then set about collecting firewood for the evening. We were quiet while we worked, and I attributed that to the fact that we were both focused on finding good logs. But afterwards, Eduardo didn't seem to cheer up again. I realized halfway through preparing my dinner that he wasn't going to join me, but he said he wasn't hungry and would eat later whenever he felt like it. But later he arrived and still didn't seem to feel like eating. We stayed up quite late, and all we did was sit by the fire swapping stories. But I didn't see a shred of food pass through his lips. When I went into my shelter to sleep, Eduardo said that he would just stay up a while longer to look at the stars. That didn't raise any alarms for me. But what it did was when I woke up about 6 or 7 hours later to find him still sitting by the fire. I don't mean sitting by the fire making a cup of tea, with my hair tousled and obviously having slept at least a few hours. I mean the same position, with the tent seemingly intact, as if not a muscle had been moved for hours on end. The first words that came out of my mouth when I left my shelter were, "Didn't you sleep?" He didn't need to answer me. The big dark circles under his eyes said it all. And that's when I started to realize that accepting the camping trip might not have been a good idea. I asked him if he was okay, and I really laughed a little when he said, "A little tired." I responded by asking him if he was really okay, before telling him there was no shame in giving up and going home if he really wasn't feeling well. It was a total bluff, but it worked, and that's when he partially told me what he had planned. There was no hiking, no river tour for a few days before a big breakfast in Chiapa de Corzo. He and I, to use his words, needed to do something for Laura and the baby, and that meant not eating or sleeping. It was okay to drink water, but only when I was really thirsty and after abstaining from eating and sleeping for 3 days. I was going to go to the waterfall. Remember the waterfall I mentioned? The one we had in sight from our camp. Well, Eduardo said there was a small gap in the rock behind her. It wasn't anything big, just big enough for a person to sit on without getting too wet. And when I asked him how he knew, he told me that he had checked it overnight. Everything was exactly as he said it would be. And when I asked him what it was, Eduardo said he was too tired to explain it. The only reason he partially explained what he was doing was because he needed me there and believed that if he didn't tell me, I really could have left. I knew what he looked like, a guy who's starving himself because he's tired of living or something. But he assured me he wasn't like that. He needed me there to help him get back to the car when he was done, because he'd probably be too weak to do it himself. I remember sitting there by the fire for a minute or two, stunned in silence, trying to understand what Eduardo was telling me. When I finally gathered my thoughts, I asked him why he needed to sit in that little hole after 3 days without eating or sleeping. It would help him, of course. He just needed to know why. Again, he just said something like, "It's for Laura and the baby." And if I'm honest, that was as good as an explanation I needed. I had no idea what I was trying to do, but I knew it would be difficult and probably dangerous as well. But what else can you do when a friend asks you to do something like that, telling you that they can't trust anyone else to do it? There was no way to get him out of there. Leaving him simply wasn't an option, and as much as it seemed like the best option, calling emergency services felt like a betrayal. Imagine someone puts all their trust in you, and you just refuse and have them arrested. I know that's the emotional response and not the rational one, but at the time it just didn't feel right. There seemed to be no choice but to do what he asked to make sure that no matter what, it went well on the other side. It turns out that the first day of his fast was really the day before we left. The second was the hike to the waterfall. Eduardo looked a little exhausted on the hike, but I chalked it up to age and a bad night's sleep or something. So that second day that we were in Chiapa de Corzo, it would be the third and last day without eating or sleeping, which meant that their entire plan was going to end in the wee hours of the morning. That sounded like good news when I heard it, but I was still worried to see him in such a bad state. It was the lack of sleep that really drained him. I could see how his brain was wasting away from being awake for so long without fuel, and when he went to the bathroom, his urine looked brown. Not that unhealthy dark yellow color you see after a summer night in a beer garden. It was a sickly brown, like rum or whiskey or something. I know it may seem a little strange to fixate on their urine like that, but things like that are pretty shocking when you've never seen them before. And it wasn't just his body, it was his mind. He began to repeat things, to stumble over the words, and then to return to an earlier point in a conversation as if he had lost the thread, and 10 or 20 minutes had not passed. And when the sun began to set, it was ready for it all to end. But we still had a long way to go before that. I didn't sleep for a second that night, nor was I completely convinced that Eduardo wasn't trying to hurt himself in some way. I just had to trust that I wouldn't. I questioned him more and more as the night wore on, but he was less and less in the mood to chat. However, he told me that he had been thinking about that night for months and had gone over it so many times that he was bored thinking about it, let alone talking about it. He told me that he understood how annoying it must be, but he would tell me everything when he was done. But until then, he had to wait. Finally, the time came. I took him to the waterfall, and he started taking off his clothes. I guess that was always a given. I didn't want to get his only jacket and pair of boots wet in the process, but it was freezing cold and shivering like a dog when he handed me the last of his clothes over the noise of the waterfall. Over the sound of the waterfall, I heard him tell me that if he called or it didn't come out within an hour, I should go and get him out. He would be naked and soaked in the middle of the frozen Chiapas night and would be in danger of hypothermia if he was exposed too long. And that only added more anxiety to the whole situation. When he thanked me for the last time, he turned around and disappeared into the water. Exactly 27 minutes passed when I thought I heard something about the noise of the waterfall. I remember sharpening my ears, thinking that my ears were playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. It was barely audible over the noise of the waterfall, but it sounded a lot like a person. And then, suddenly, there was Eduardo. He was white as paper, skinny as a stick, and trembling violently. Then there were the noises I was making, and God, they were inhuman. Not exactly crying, not exactly screaming, all dulled by 3 days without food or sleep. As soon as he reached the banks of the stream, he just collapsed and I threw his jacket around him. He couldn't speak. He could barely move. And I did my best to drag him back into the fire and leave him there to warm up properly. I asked him if he could eat, and he nodded very weakly. So I threw a few cereal bars and a bottle of water in front of him. I had to feed him and bring the bottle to his lips so that he could eat properly. Eduardo ate slowly with silent tears rolling down his cheeks, and I spilled some too. Once he had eaten some more and drunk water, Eduardo asked me to help him into his tent so he could finally sleep. I made sure it was dry, helped to put on a few layers, and then put it in a sleeping bag. I think he was already asleep before I finished tucking him in, and I wanted nothing more than to crawl into my own sleeping bag for a well-deserved rest. But when the time came, I couldn't do it. I was caught between being too tired to stay awake and too scared to fall asleep. But the more I fought against it, the easier it became. I don't know exactly what time it was at that time, but I remember seeing some blue light on the distant horizon. I closed my eyes for a second, and then the next thing I knew, it was broad daylight. My eyes were burning, and I felt sick from how exhausted I was. But when I saw that Eduardo was still there, breathing and asleep, I knew everything was going to be okay. I tried to sleep a couple more hours, but a hyperactive brain, fueled by a nap, made that impossible. I wanted to wake him up, make him eat some more, and give him some coffee, but it was for selfish reasons. What he really wanted to know was what had happened in the waterfall, why he had undergone hell. But God knows I needed the break, and there would be plenty of time to ask questions on the way back. I guess this piece is long enough to summarize that conversation as best I can. After getting Eduardo back to Chiapa de Corzo safely, we bought some more food. I bought Eduardo one of those big bottles of coconut water, so he could keep replenishing himself on the trip, and then we started our journey back home. He didn't tell me much about what he had done, or why he had done it. He said he was still processing it himself, but in short, it went like this. He had read something online about that waterfall, something about how old shamans used to go there to have spiritual experiences. The story said that if you focused on meditating for someone with enough intensity, someone who had already passed away, you could feel their presence, receive their guidance or connection, or something like that. The only rule was that you had to sit there for 3 days with nothing but coconut water in front of you to drink. Obviously, Eduardo tried to simplify the process for safety and convenience, thinking that as long as he drank some water, he could do the entire fast and stay away from the waterfall itself. He was quite worried that it would have ruined the process and thus ruined the desired effect, but it didn't. According to Eduardo, the process had worked exactly as intended. I feel that I have to explain at this point that I am not a very spiritual person, and I do not believe in paranormal or spiritual experiences. I think Eduardo pushed himself to his physical and psychological limits and induced a kind of trance or altered state of consciousness. And I think that, deep down, he knows it too. The thing is, he doesn't care, and I don't really blame him either. And as much as I don't pretend to know how it worked, I understand why I wanted to have that opportunity to feel the presence or connection with a deceased loved one, even if it's not real. I admit that I see the appeal. Anyone who has been through something as tragic as losing their wife and daughter in an accident deserves some kind of comfort, even if that comfort is self-induced. And if sitting behind a waterfall for 3 days gave Eduardo some peace of mind, then who am I to judge him? At the end of the day, Eduardo wasn't hurting anyone else. He was just dealing with his own pain in the best way he knew how. And if that meant doing something as extreme as what he did, then so be it. So there it is, the story of our trip to the mountains of Chiapas. It's not the typical camping and hiking adventure we were hoping for, but it was an experience we'll never forget. And while Eduardo hasn't told me all the details of what happened behind that waterfall, I respect his privacy enough not to pressure him. Whatever he experienced there, we will leave it between him and his deceased loved ones. The important thing is that, after all, Eduardo is doing much better, and that's the only thing that really matters. Story 4. I am a 31-year-old woman originally from Oaxaca, and I was 28 years old when this story happened, during the time of the #YoTambian movement. I remember talking to a friend about the whole topic of not all men. We both agreed that it was ridiculous to label all men as predators, but we disagreed on something a little more subtle. My friend believed that since virtually anyone, no matter how nice they seemed or how nice they acted, could be a predator, it made sense to exercise some degree of caution with every man outside of the immediate family. I thought that was a rather pessimistic way of looking at things, and that it made sense to use caution on a case-by-case basis. I wasn't going to dial the first 2 digits of 911 on my phone if an Uber driver asked me what my day had been like, but I would bring my pepper spray if I was heading to a dark street. We debated about it for a while, over a few drinks of alcohol, and while they were always friendly exchanges, we never came to any solid conclusions. However, my friend said something that really struck me. Not all men, but one is enough. I had no idea how right I was. You see, a few months later, I drove to Valle de Bravo in my native Oaxaca, parked my car in the old dam parking lot, and then headed for my favorite trail into the surrounding mountains. Anyway, I climbed up to almost where the trails begin, took my photos, and then started to go down towards the village, taking photos along the way. Halfway through, I came to a detour in the trail to my left, and when I looked, I saw someone standing there on the trail. He immediately stood out because he wasn't wearing hiking clothes, and he'd never seen anyone so high up the trail who wasn't wearing hiking or hiking gear. He had long hair, sneakers, baggy shorts, and a t-shirt. An average white skater kid. Maybe 20 to 24, I guess. That wasn't entirely extraordinary on its own. But this boy didn't have a backpack or water bottle. He just looked lost. We looked at each other for a second, and I smiled politely at him before continuing on my way. But as I was doing so, I heard him call me something like, "Does this trail go up the mountains?" I told him no, but that I would take him to a path that would, and then I wished him luck and kept walking. I don't even think I took 4 or 5 steps before I heard him call again. But this time he said something so strange that it really made me laugh quietly. The guy says, in a way that made it seem like there had been some minor confusion, "Hey, do you think that's my backpack?" I stopped, smiled at how crazy his statement was, and then turned and told him, with a hint of laughter, that he must be confused. He started walking towards me slowly and calmly, saying, "No, that's totally my backpack. I've been looking for her all afternoon." Giving him the benefit of the doubt, I simply took the backpack off my shoulders and then showed it to him, saying, "I can promise you it's mine. It even has my name on it, look." And I showed her the label that said Maddie. He leaned over and narrowed his eyes as if the writing was tiny and not in large capital letters, and then asked me in a voice that sounded genuinely hurt, "Why would you do that?" I remember literally hearing the "how about the some out" jingle in my head, and this guy was playing a stupid joke on me with his friend recording from behind a tree. Or he was really crazy, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out which one the real one was. I raised my courtesy to 100, smiled at him, and said, "I'm very sorry, but I have to go. I hope you find your backpack well." He fell silent as I turned around and started to walk away, and I found myself waiting for it to be the end of the encounter. But as I discovered, that was more of an optimistic thought than an accurate assessment. As the sound of his footsteps followed me down the path, I began to get nervous. This was no longer an unusual encounter with a weird stranger, but rather the weird stranger was now following me down a quiet hillside path with no other soul in sight. Remember what I said about pepper spray and dark streets? That rule also applied to mountain trails, and I always carry one of those cute mini pepper sprays on my car keys. In one smooth motion, I took the backpack off my shoulders again, reached into the small pocket where I kept the car keys, and then tucked them into the pocket for easier access. And once it was in place, I felt a little more comfortable to vocalize again. I asked the guy if he was following me, and he said yes, because he had his backpack. I told him it wasn't a funny joke, and it wasn't even funny the first time, and he told me it wasn't a joke, that he wanted me to give him his backpack back, and if I didn't, he would have to take it by force. We kept walking, me with my back to him, and him about 5 meters behind me. I told the boy that it was starting to sound like he was threatening me. When she heard that, she adopted an indignant tone, wondering how I dared to play the victim when I was the one who had stolen her backpack. I was so convinced it was a joke at the time that I actually stopped, turned around, and started looking for the equally dumb skater guy with some smartphone. Looking back, I think that was just a hopeful thought. If there was anyone else there, I wasn't dealing with another crazy person, but when I realized that we were truly alone on the trail, that wasn't a pleasant feeling, I can tell you. So once I realized that this guy was either insane or trying to rob me in the strangest way imaginable, I reached for my pepper spray. I pulled it out, showed it to him, and he pulled out that frustration card again. I told him that if he didn't stop following me, I would spray him with pepper spray and then call the police. He responded by saying things like, "Do it, call the police. That's my backpack that you carry, with my things inside." Again, I told him that if he came within 1.5 meters of me, I would spray him with the pepper spray. And then I turned and immediately realized the problem I was facing. If I really wanted to be safe, I would have to walk backwards the damn rest of the way to Valle de Bravo. The best I could do was keep a minimum safe distance and keep my hand on the pepper spray. This guy followed me for a long distance, yelling at me as we walked down. And the more he talked, the more rude he became. He may have mentioned at first that he acted politely and well-mannered, then changed to a victim tone that he had adopted. But as time went on, he became more and more rude. I remember at one point she said something like, "I don't understand why you're being such a bitch about it. Just admit that you're wrong and hand me my stuff." And then he became more aggressive. He started saying things like, "You need therapy. You could do hours of sessions and not solve all the damn mess you have in your head." He actually said that. My blood was boiling, but I knew it was better not to react. If anything, I just wanted to stop so I could get close again. Or if not, I just wanted this weird attention that I chose not to give it. Aside from occasionally looking over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't trying to get close to me, I tried not to give the boy a single word. The distance from where I met the guy to where the trail ended was maybe only a mile. So after a few minutes of walking, I could literally see people walking near the houses at the end of the trail, and just seeing them was such a relief. I felt like I was almost back in friendly territory, you know. Even if the boy was being an idiot, he wouldn't dare to lay hands on me if there were other people around. But what's even better, I suddenly see these two hikers walking down the trail towards us. I figured that instead of risking this guy following me back to my car, I would ask these hikers to accompany me. But as we got closer, the guy following me tried one last trick. As soon as I called the two hikers, he started screaming over me. She was saying things like, "Help me. My sister offered medicine, and she wants to take her own life. You have to help me grab her." I remember looking back, completely boiling at the time, wondering if I had accidentally bumped into the greatest psychopath on the planet. And then, when I turned to say something against what he said, I heard these quick, heavy footsteps approaching me. I remember turning around and seeing the guy running towards me and letting out a blast of pepper spray at the last second before he bumped into me. Thank goodness, most, if not all, of the spray was effective despite his efforts to protect his face as he ran toward me. When I found my feet, I was shaken but still furious, and it was deeply satisfying to see him rubbing his eyes and screaming in pain. The hikers had rushed to the scene the moment I got up, and I explained everything to them very clearly, that the cretin was not my brother, and that he had been harassing me all the way down the trail. Very kindly, they told me that they would keep it there for as long as it took for me to lose sight of me, and as I walked away, I pulled out my phone and called the police. I was almost at the end of the trail when I heard the scream. You can't tell me shit from a far distance, and just as I turned to look back, the two hikers were grappling with this guy on the ground. I kept walking as I related all of this information to the 911, feeling incredibly grateful that those two hikers showed up when they did. Even when I thought I was safe, I now know, looking back, that I wasn't. People have been kidnapped in broad daylight before, and you can't tell what would have happened if he had continued to follow me. What I find incredibly creepy to this day is how crafty he tried to be, and how he seemed to enjoy trying to mentally go over me instead of physically. Although I have the feeling that the mental was just an appetizer for something he never had the opportunity to do. He couldn't tell if he was truly psychotic or just mentally ill. Story 5. Born on December 19, 1986, Martina Iakovich grew up in Mexico as the only daughter of divorced Filipino immigrants Elizabeth and Mario Iakovich. Like many Filipinos, she had a devout Catholic upbringing and was also described as a hardworking and natural leader, with ambitions to attend teachers' college at the Autonomous University of Nuevo Leon in Monterrey. Standing 6 feet tall and weighing 56 pounds, he kept fit by playing volleyball and only occasionally tried jogging. Shortly before the 2007 civic holiday, Martina had planned to participate in a Christian youth conference in the city of Guadalajara. but at the last minute changed her mind in favor of a hiking trip to the Cascada Cola de Caballo National Park in Nuevo Leon, accompanied by her cousin Fatima Casilo, 20 years old, and 2 friends, Hernan Miga and Jose Bernardi. The Cola de Caballo Waterfall National Park covers an area of approximately 3 square kilometers and is located in the Sierra Madre Oriental between the cities of Santiago and Monterrey. There are 2 main camping areas within its boundaries. The main site of Villa de Santiago, which is only a few hundred meters from the park entrance, and the smaller site of El Chipitan, which is 3 kilometers to the west, not far from National Highway 85. Most of the hiking trails in the park are relatively easy, averaging between 3 and 5 kilometers. The only exception is the Sendero de la Meseta, which is an impressive 53 kilometers long and crosses the park from El Chipitan to the village of El Cercado. Going off the trails to the Cola de Caballo waterfall takes you to what some have described as the most rugged terrain in the region. Just after noon on Sunday, August 5th, 2007, Martina and her friends arrived at the park. Martina had been behind the wheel for the 14-hour drive from Monterrey, and after completing what became a 2-day trip, the group was exhausted. They set up camp in Lot 88 of the Villa de Santiago camp, and then exchanged some friendly greetings with their new but temporary neighbors. Although the Villa de Santiago area was very busy that weekend, with only a few lots unoccupied, while the bustle of the holiday weekend continued outside, Martina and her friends settled in for a siesta. The group was exhausted from their 2-day-long journey, so what was meant to be a half-hour nap turned into more of a 4-hour nap. They woke up around 10:30 p.m., made a small campfire, and then dined together while consuming a small amount of alcohol. Around 3:30 a.m., the group decided to go back to bed, and they all fell asleep within a span of about 30 minutes. 3 hours later, Martina woke Hernan up and asked him to accompany her to the camp's community showers. According to Hernan, the couple had planned to go for a run together at dawn, and after washing and dressing, they headed for the trails. They ran together for about 30 minutes, and at some point Martina began to get tired. Upon reaching an intersection near the park's entrance, the couple decided to part ways, and Hernan would continue on the longer trail to National Highway 85, while Martina would opt to visit the nearby Cola de Caballo waterfall before returning to camp. Hernan only made it to a small picnic area by the side of the road before he also began to get tired. He paused briefly to catch his breath, carved the initials of the 4 members into a rock, and then returned to the camp. According to him, he spent the next few hours looking for an axe to rough some oversized logs, but he couldn't find one. Around 9:30 a.m., Jose Bernardi and Fatima Castillo came out of their tents, prepared breakfast and showered, believing that Martina would return at any moment. But by 11 a.m., they began to worry. Jose and Hernan went along one of the trails to the waterfall that Martina had wanted to visit. They also searched the Cerro de la Silla Trail and the Cola de Caballo Waterfall Trail, as well as several other trails where they suspected she might have jogged, but they found her nowhere to be found. The 2 men remained calm and avoided raising the alarm, believing that Martina would be found soon. By mid-afternoon, however, he still hadn't returned. Around 2 p.m., the group approached a park ranger at the park to report Martina missing. Park rangers joined the group of friends and continued to search nearby trails and beaches. When it became clear that she was missing, they were advised to report her missing to the police. The Nuevo Leon Police Regional Emergency Response Team took over the search and quickly set up a command post near the Cola de Caballo waterfall. Nearly 100 people then scoured the area, including police officers, firefighters, and specially trained divers who searched nearby rivers and streams. They used GPS equipment, underwater radar, infrared cameras, and 4 K9 units, as well as 2 fixed-wing aircraft, a seaplane, 3 helicopters, and a large number of boats. However, no trace of Martina was found. Adverse weather and steep terrain made the search extremely difficult, and some members of the search team were seriously injured in the course of their work. One man needed emergency surgery after an accident while descending, resulting in horrific facial lacerations, while another was taken to the hospital with a sprained ankle and an injured knee after a fall down a steep incline. An unusual aspect of the search was the use of sniffer dogs that walked up and down the trails of the Cola de Caballo waterfall and Cerro de la Silla in search of Martina. Although they picked up her trail in places where she had been running with Hernan Miga, there was no trace of her anywhere else, including near the waterfall. He had disappeared, but his scent trail suggested that he had left the park. At this point, Martina's search became highly scientific. Search teams began studying maps of the area to identify so-called anthropogenic corridors, which are natural trails that occur off the beaten path, such as streams or rivers, and even power lines. Anything a person might believe will lead them back to civilization. They also based their Phase 2 search areas on a highly advanced behavioral profile of lost hikers, which indicated that there was a 90% chance that he was still within an 8-kilometer radius of his last known position. But his health status was another question entirely. The strategy led to some interesting developments in the search. A pair of socks were recovered from a deep well of water in the Ramos River, a tributary that flows into the Pilon River. Search teams also found several footprints in the mossy area of the ground, not far from the waterfall, and while the footprints matched the size of Iakovic's shoe, the lack of a preserved sole pattern made it impossible to determine if they were created by one of his running shoes. Against the advice of the state police, Martina's family traveled to the Cola de Caballo waterfall. There, they set up a series of tents on lots rented by friends and do-gooders, and refused to leave until Martina was found. They were accompanied by Raul Escarpi, a Catholic priest and also a Filipino-Mexican, who held special masses for the family to calm their fears. Escarpi also helped raise the public profile of the case, and in just a few days, a team of around 200 volunteers was searching the surrounding area. The team included politicians from nearby Santiago and Monterrey, but also some very experienced search and rescue members who weren't just taking the opportunity as a photo op. On August 11th, a search was conducted that lasted a full 8 hours, covering the area between the east beach of the National Park and National Highway 85. The next day, he signaled another lengthy search, but this time fewer than 100 of the original volunteers showed up to try again. Frustrated by the lack of results, Martina's relatives openly admitted that their hope was fading. Senior Nuevo Leon police officials assured them that the chances of their survival were high, but their loved ones were clearly prepared for the worst. On August 21st, police began using an unsettling euphemism to refer to Martina as an unresponsive person, meaning she would not have been able to respond if searchers had called her name. This led to the reassignment of all aircraft and canine units away from the search, leaving only a reduced team of 20 officers to continue the effort. 2 days later, the search was called off, and it was announced that investigative theories were now focusing on the possibility of a kidnapping. However, Iakovic's family again openly criticized the investigation, stating that the kidnapping theory was not based on any concrete evidence. It was widely accepted that, dead or alive, Martina was no longer in the park. But if that was the case, where did she go? Some argue that Martina disappeared as a result of a puma attack, and that any potential remains were carried and consumed by the animal. However, if this were the case, there would certainly be evidence in the form of torn clothing, blood, or drag marks. A local wildlife expert was quoted as saying that it was not impossible but highly unlikely that Martina had fallen victim to a puma, and that predators of that type rarely travel more than 185 meters before consuming prey. Another possibility is that Martina died as a result of what could legally be referred to as an accident. Many have cited Martina's lack of experience hiking in nature and believed that it likely led to getting lost and disoriented, especially if she was already exhausted after her long 2-day trip. However, again, if this had been the case, some trace of her would have been recovered, even if it was the tragic discovery of her lifeless body. With this in mind, we began to understand the frustrations experienced by law enforcement and why more and more people involved began to suspect foul play. As recently as 2018, Martina's mother had expressed her belief that her daughter was kidnapped or murdered, citing the proximity of the nearby National Highway 40. Elizabeth believed that her overconfident daughter might have been a perfect target for a would-be killer, who could then escape almost instantly despite accusations that Martina's 3 friends had something to do with her disappearance. They have vehemently denied any involvement and are not considered suspects. Don MacArthur, the former mayor of Santiago, has stated that he does not believe any local residents are to blame for his kidnapping or murder. According to him, the only other known homicide in the area occurred in 2005 and was mainly related to the local drug trade. Perhaps one of the most likely theories was raised by the host of Immer's El Próximo Paso podcast, David Ridgen, who suggested that convicted sexual predator Eduardo Leon could have been involved in Martina's disappearance, given her history of abusing teenagers. In addition, Martina's disappearance fits into the window of time in which Leon was actively lurking. Ridgen theorized that after her run, Martina took off her socks to enter the waters of the Ramos River, and it was there that she was ambushed by her killer. He dismissed the idea that the socks recovered from the river could not have belonged to Martina, saying they only looked bigger due to being submerged for so long. However, Ridgen's theories, while appearing to be well thought out, have been widely dismissed by the Nuevo Leon State Police, who do not believe Martina was deliberately or maliciously killed. In fact, 1 or 2 detectives even suggested the idea that Martina intentionally disappeared to sever ties with her community and family. It certainly wouldn't be the first time that a member of a strict religious community had a sudden change of heart and, instead of facing the anger and embarrassment of their loved ones, disappeared. However, there is strong evidence to suggest that Martina had a wonderful relationship with her parents and continued to share her deep Christian faith. He was steadfast in his attendance at certain Christian youth organizations, and even after withdrawing from his most recent conference, he opted for a weekend of camp with friends he met at one of those same conferences. Although the possibility cannot be completely ruled out, as people have hidden worse secrets from their families before. In this case, what happened to Martina clearly did not happen of her own volition. However, other members of the search and rescue team have questioned the effectiveness of the entire search effort. One volunteer claimed that entire sections of the forest were so dense that if a person were to be immobilized, the surrounding mass of vegetation would be enough to keep their body upright, potentially hiding the body of any other aerial search team, which by far covered most of the ground during the search. Nuevo Leon Police Officer Greg Beasley also spoke of such difficulties, telling a reporter that when you stumble, you don't fall. Perhaps the closest any investigation has come to uncovering the truth behind Martina's disappearance was in March 2009, when a volunteer from the Mexico City Search and Rescue nonprofit claimed that he believed volunteers actually located Martina's remains in November 2009. During this privately funded search, 6 cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human remains at a location in the Ramos River, but further investigation was made impossible due to the speed and depth of the water. Hussey believes that if private search and rescue teams had had access to more advanced equipment, their task could have been concluded there and then. Perhaps that is indeed the case, and Martina Iakovic's remains lie deep beneath the waters of the Cola de Cabala waterfall. But just as many other clues in the case have proven to be dead ends, Perhaps the reason she has never been found in the park is that she is no longer there. As one police officer put it, the absence of remains is perhaps the best possible indicator that Martina was abducted, which begs the question, has the predator who took her encountered some other kind of vicarious justice, or do they still walk among us?